I'm going to be reading from Through Animals' Eyes again. This was the second book that I wrote, and I think it's important to note that I never really wrote a book. What I did was, of course, as y'all know who have been receiving our newsletter for a long time, was I wrote a series of stories and do write stories for the newsletter. And I was fortunate that one of our members, Terry Hershey in Houston, she thought they were wonderful, and she wanted me to write a book. And I just explained to her that I just don't have the self-discipline to do that, to sit down and write a book. So she said, well, can I have the stories? And I said, sure, that was fine. So she took them to University of North Texas Press, and the editor there loved them. And she and that editor turned the stories into a manuscript. They didn't make me do anything because they knew if I had to do any of those things, I would have never gotten around to doing them. So they did it, turned it into a manuscript, and that was book one. And then people seemed really drawn to the stories and seemed to like them. So then when I had written another group of stories, became book two. So I'm reading from book two today. It is called Seeing with New Eyes. I didn't put any titles on the stories that I wrote because, as you all know, they're newsletter stories, and I never titled newsletter stories, but the editor put titles on them. So she gets all the credit for that. Whether they're good or bad, she gets the credit for that. Okay, this is about a squirrel. This is about an elderly gentleman and a squirrel family, actually. And it's about trying to help somebody who doesn't seem to have a real strong feeling for all animals, but loved some animals, to expand his love of animals to include more animals. And in this case, to include squirrels, who he started out not liking at all, which none of us can imagine that. It seems to me that it is all too easy to take animals for granted. Those of us who are fortunate to live in the company of dogs or cats, we see them every day, we feed them, we brush them, we take them to the vet, we fuss over them. If they annoy us, we chastise them, and we love them. Usually, until their later years, we assume they will always be around, always be part of our lives. On a larger scale, our society views animals as voiceless, emotionless creatures who live their lives with an utter lack of desire, needs, or reason. I've often wondered what would happen if one day everybody decided to spend 1 week of their life simply observing a backyard full of birds, or follow their beloved companion animal about doing as the animal does, walking, scratching, napping, simply being, or really getting to know a cow, a sheep, or a chicken. Perhaps then, ancient, now sleeping sensitivities would once again awaken in us. I firmly believe our lives would be greatly enhanced. If we were keen observers, what would we see? And how would we label what our eyes and hearts took in? Would we become uncomfortable if we noticed similarities between the animal's behavior and our own? We are, after all, members of the animal kingdom. I imagine that if we were wise enough to draw parallels between human and non-human animal behavior, there would be less managing, killing, and exploiting of the animal kingdom. Perhaps we would stop believing it is acceptable to break horses, manage herds, and factory farm cows. I was trying my best to explain this to the gentleman who called Wildlife Rescue. He called us because he wanted us to send someone out to remove every squirrel who lived or even traveled through his 12 or so block neighborhood. It's a small area, he told me, so why not just come out, set several traps, and catch the little rodents, as he liked to refer to them. He told me how he dearly loved to sit and watch the birds come to his feeder. They gave him such joy, and they're so beautiful to watch, he explained. I asked him if he could imagine seeing the same beauty and finding that same joy in squirrels. Absolutely not, was his adamant response. These squirrels are nothing but a nuisance. He was quite clear. He wanted them removed, and he expected us to carry out the nasty deed. It's important to understand that we try to adhere to a policy at WRR. Our policy is that we do our best to help every caller in some way or another. It is not uncommon that our way of helping is to educate. I cannot tell you how many times over the past years we have encountered callers who simply do not want to be educated. I can assure you this gentleman was one of them. Wildlife Rescue does not believe it is in any healthy wild animal's best interest to be removed from the areas she calls home. We do not believe or think that it is at all correct to live trap urban wild animals and take them away from known food sources, family members, and a comfortable, familiar life simply because we human animals have decided that they are a so-called nuisance. So when someone asks us to remove every squirrel in a neighborhood, then we feel it is time to educate, even though we are often confronted with a very unwilling student. We were particularly concerned in this situation because we knew that mother squirrels were already setting up housekeeping and babies were not far behind, if in fact they were not already on the scene. I did everything I could to convince our caller to leave the squirrels alone. I told him to take a close look at their endearing faces, to watch them at play, to get to know them. I knew anyone who loves birds surely could be a squirrel convert as well. But our caller would have none of it. He threatened to put out poison, to shoot the squirrels, to set up steel jaw traps in the trees. This guy was definitely a tough customer. I kept talking, buying time with every conversation. Little did I know that things were going to get stickier before they got better. Why is it that the rain and wind so often come just when you don't need them, or at least just when you think you don't need them? 2 or 3 days had passed and our gentleman friend had not called to complain. I had not called him because of the rain and the wind. Babies were starting to come in at our sanctuary, and as you might have guessed, almost all were squirrel babies. I hated to think what was going on in our caller's neighborhood if he'd made good on even one of his threats. I decided to gather up my courage and call him. As luck would have it, just the night before, the wind had brought down a mother squirrel's nest, babies and all, right in his backyard. I anxiously inquired about the babies, half holding my breath. He did not mince words. He had them. He was going to kill them. That was that. All 4 of them. He wanted them all dead. I told him, please, just set them outside. Their mother would come and get them. If she did not, then we would send someone over and pick them up. No, ma'am, was his reply. If he could not get rid of all the squirrels, at least he could get rid of these 4 babies. I could not talk fast enough or say anything to convince him. I tried to appeal to his sympathy for the innocent pink babies, but he only slammed down the phone. Fortunately, we asked for the address of every caller, so we knew how to find our friend, and hopefully we could get to his house in time to save these squirrels. When our volunteer arrived, he could get no response. No one answered the door, and he could find no trace of a nest, nor could he find any neighbors who knew the caller's whereabouts. I felt sure that we'd failed. Not only had we not educated, we had alienated someone and ultimately had lost the lives of 4 innocent animals. It was not a good day. I could feel little other than pity, though, for this unknown man. He seemed so sad to me. He could love birds and hate squirrels? That made no sense. Why is it that animals have to be the way we think they should be before we consider them worthy of our respect? Why is it so easy to pick our favorite species instead of seeing the beauty in all of them? I waited until the next day around noon, then decided it was worth one more try. I had all my speeches ready. I knew just what I was going to say when he answered the phone. I was ready to be as accommodating as I could, to talk him into letting those babies live. The phone rang 3 times before he even answered. I apologized for bothering him, but asked if there was some way we could possibly get the 4 baby squirrels. His reply was brief and to the point, as always. You're too late. I've already taken care of the problem. I asked him what had he done. Well, I put them outside like you told me to. Suddenly his voice softened. And you will not believe what happened, he says. That mama squirrel came down out of that big old oak tree and sniffed around. She ran back up the tree when I tried to go near her, so I let her be. She came back in only a few minutes, sniffed some more, grabbed one of those tiny, tiny pink babies in her mouth, and up the tree she took off like a shot. I couldn't believe how fast she could run with that baby in her mouth. And you know, she came back for each one of those babies. I have never seen anything like it in my life. I always thought squirrels were just dirty little rodents. I have never seen anything like it in my life. He went on and on about how the mother looked thin, and so he decided to set up a squirrel feeder. He talked about how she'd had quite a job ahead of her raising a family of all 4 just by herself. So he thought he should help out in any way he could. We talked about what squirrels like to eat and how soon the babies would leave the nest and how he could look forward to watching them grow up right there in his backyard. There was no more discussion of traps, of poison, no thought of harming or killing, just a simple, important revelation and appreciation of life and all the amazing, beautiful forms it takes. Thanks to that beauty, somewhere in San Antonio, there's a small, quiet, tree-studded neighborhood where the natural devotion of a mother squirrel opened the eyes of an elderly gentleman who now sits quietly watching her care for her young. So, those of course are always the wonderful stories, the ones where we actually break through somebody's hard shell and hopefully change their lives a bit. Anybody have any comments or questions from? Well, so squirrels, of course, if you're talking about just what they have, a natural diet, they'll eat certain shoots and buds. They like, of course, acorns. They like nuts as well. Some different trees, they'll eat some tree bark. They eat hackberries, the little berries off the hackberry trees. They'll eat some leaf matter. If we're talking about what they like sitting in a feeder somewhere, then anybody who's ever put out a bird feeder and seen squirrels come to it knows that they love sunflower seeds and peanuts and millet and milo and all the things that are in wild bird seed. People do, unfortunately, put out a lot of corn for squirrels. Corn seems to be a thing that the animal food manufacturers really sell lots of, I suspect because it's cheap to produce and colorful, so people buy it. They have dried ears of corn that they say is squirrel food. Well, corn is just not really a good food, period. It's not really good for anybody all that much, and certainly not particularly good for wildlife. So when people ask us about putting corn out for squirrels, we say just please basically don't. It's not good for squirrels or deer. If you're going to put out a very little bit, maybe okay, just as a sweetener because it is very sweet. But basically you want to stick with just a good high quality wild bird seed if you're thinking of feeding squirrels. Otherwise, they're simply going to find the food that is being provided by nature in the trees and in the ground as well. And of course we have pecan trees in Texas and a lot of other places. They love the pecans, they bury them. As everybody perhaps has seen, they have about 10, 20 different burial sites for their stash of food. Sometimes they won't go back and get it, and a pecan tree will grow there, which is kind of cool. So yeah, nuts, berries, shoots, some grasses, things of that nature. Flower buds, they like certain flower buds as well. Well, and see, that's another good point is, and you know, at Wildlife Rescue, we get so many calls from really caring people who will see something about an animal that seems, or perhaps is a little abnormal. But we really try to remind people again that nature equips these animals with an ability and innate ability to survive. And if they've been reared by their parent, then they have good antibodies to stay healthy. If they have been with them long enough to learn either how to run or climb or fly, depending on the species, then they've got that ability down as well. They might not look to us always like they're perfectly formed. I will tell you that they don't care about that at all in each other or themselves, and they don't see that as a lack. They just keep going. And even with a squirrel who perhaps got caught by a cat and got a leg chewed off, they just keep going. And they really have a great ability to heal themselves, to keep their wounds clean. We see a lot of three-legged deer. On the one hand, we have to be wise about trusting wildlife to take care of themselves. And on the other hand, we have to know when they really do need help. And there's a fine line there sometimes. But we've learned, because we've been around so long at Wildlife Rescue, we've really been able to learn what they can deal with on their own and when they need help. And usually, for the most part, when they're an adult, a healthy adult, just leave them alone. They can deal with it just fine. listen, I have a farmer's almanac that I swear by, so I appreciate that question. Yes, yes, those old adages are very, very true. I mean, animals, again, they know what's going on before it happens, where nature is concerned, and they adapt. They adapt in every way that we don't usually even notice. So yes, a denser fur will generally indicate a rough winter, or something that's going to be requiring them to have a denser fur. We would naturally interpret that as cold. It's going to be cold. They might have other reasons to have that, to grow a denser fur. The woolly bear caterpillar, the black, real fuzzy, they're about this long caterpillar, you will notice as well with them in the fall, if they're really woolly, generally we have a stronger, harsher winter. So yeah, wild animals have been predicting what's going on in the weather for a long time. Well, squirrels, generally 2 litters a year, usually February, and then again not until September, though I have to say, with climate change and all the nuances of climate change that the wildlife are feeling long before we are feeling it, we are seeing some differences in the timing of all native species having their babies. But squirrels do have 2 litters a year. The female squirrels, usually the fox squirrels, which is who we see around, in San Antonio area, the females usually live about 12 years in the wild. The males sometimes closer to 8 to 10 years as a rule. Of course, in captivity, everything changes, not for the better, but some would say better because they can live longer in captivity. But I think we have to remember that's an extremely diminished, boring life. So longer life, but not a particularly good one. So yes, in the wild, again, the females about a dozen or so years and the males a little bit less than that. Changes it for the better. We don't remember that these are all sentient beings, and not killing anyone is important. It's an important behavior to adopt, because everyone, and if they're an insect, if they're tiny, if they're a praying mantis and that big, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter their size. Every one of them, everyone wants to be alive. They all want simply to be alive, to keep living, that's what we want. And it's odd that our species can't seem to think and understand and relate that very simple, basic want in life to non-human animals. They just want to be left alone to live. And it doesn't matter whether they're a fire ant or a mosquito or who they are. And if we could get better about respecting that want and seeing them as someone's and sentient beings, again, we'd have a very different world than one we have right now.